for naked seeds. These are, the gymnosperms are plants that do not have fruits surrounding their seed, okay? And then there are the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants, and they all have flowers, and they all have fruits around their seed of some kind. There's a lot of things that actually count as a fruit that you might not think of as a fruit. We'll go through that a little bit more in another lecture. Let's see, what else did I want to say about that? Oh yeah, the gymnosperms also don't have flowers, they have cones. They tend to have male cones and female cones. And the male cones produce pollen and the female cones produce eggs. The flowering plants, flowering plants have flowers, not surprisingly. And some flowers can have both male and female parts, although not all flowers have both male and female parts. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the gymnosperms. Probably the gymnosperm that you are most familiar with is the conifers, because we have lots of them in Colorado. So all of those pines and firs and spruces, those are all conifers, which are a type of gymnosperm. If you've ever gone out in the spring and looked at a pine tree, you'll notice that they have little tiny soft cones that are kicking out a whole bunch of pollen. Those would be the male cones. And they have larger woody cones that have the seeds in them eventually. Those are the female cones, right? So typical of all of the gymnosperms, they have these cones. Some of the tallest tree, living tree currently, is the coastal redwood, which is a type of gymnosperm. And the oldest living tree is actually the bristlecone pine, which we do have here in Colorado. If you go up to high elevations, you can find bristlecone pine here in Colorado, and they can be thousands of years old. There are bristlecone pines that are like 3,000 years old. So they're pretty neat if you can go up to high elevations and find those guys. Questions about conifers? The reason conifers are so successful in Colorado in particular, and in climates like Colorado's, is because conifers tend to be very tolerant of cold, dry conditions. Their leaves are very small, so the needles on a conifer are actually leaves. If you've looked closely at pine or fir needles, you may notice that they're very waxy on the outside. So those needles are really tolerant to desiccation, so they're not losing a lot of moisture out of the needles. And they don't drop their needles in the winter, so they're able to photosynthesize throughout the year, even in the wintertime. And that gives them an advantage in habitats such as ours. All right, other types of gymnosperm include the cycads. This looks like a palm tree, but it is not a palm tree. Palm trees are actually a type of flowering plant. And the way you can tell a palm tree from a cycad, among other things, is that palm trees actually have fruits, and cycads do have cones. Those cones can be extremely large. There are actually some cycads that have female cones that weigh over 100 pounds. So they can be really, really big. You're not going to find any cycads growing in North America. They're mostly found in tropical regions. The other really cool fact about cycads is that they have the largest sperm cells of any known organism. Their sperm cells are actually visible to the naked eye. So they're about the size of a grain of table salt. So this is a grain of table salt. This is a dust mite. This is a sperm cell. So, and they've got all of these multiple flagella that can swim, let it move. So they're pretty, I don't know, I just think that's cool.
You like sperm?
I'm interested in reproductive biology. All right, and then one last gymnosperm, which these ones look less like the rest of the gymnosperms, is the ginkgos. You guys heard of the ginkgos? They're actually a common street tree. It's interesting. We have a lot of fossilized ginkgos. Ginkgos used to be much more common than they are now, they thought they had gone completely extinct. They thought there were no ginkgos left, and then they found them in a botanic garden garden somewhere in central China. And they actually have propagated them from that garden all over the world. So now they've become much more common. They're pretty common as a street tree. They're very tolerant to pollution, actually, so they make a good tree for urban areas. And in the fall, they turn this lovely shaded yellow, and they're really pretty. So people like to plant them. You do have to be cautious because there are male trees and there are female trees. The males are much more popular as a street tree because the females, when they produce their seeds are covered in they have this covering over them that the book will say it smells like rancid butter. I think it smells kind of like dog. And they will drop those everywhere. And so people, of course, they are edible. And apparently if you prepare them correctly, they can be quite delicious, but I've never prepared them. But we had some female ginkgos at one of the colleges where I used to work, and there was a little Korean lady who would come and gather all the fruits, and then she's like, "Hi, I'm gonna go make preserved ginkgo." And I'm like, "Can I have some? I want to try it," but I never managed to get any, sadly. Yeah, so that's ginkgos. All right, so that's the gymnosperms. Any questions about gymnosperms before we move on to angiosperms? Don't worry, we're almost there. Okay, so the angiosperms are the flowering plants. They are the most abundant group now. Remember that graph I showed you at the beginning? They have a huge number of angiosperms. Angiosperms have been extremely successful land plants, able to colonize all kinds of different habitats. So, for example, cactus is an angiosperm. Grasses are an angiosperm. All of these plants that have been successful at colonizing pretty harsh environments are these angiosperms. Again, they have flowers of some variety. So these are some examples of relatively showy flowers. These flowers, why do you think these flowers are so bright and colorful? What are they trying to do? Yeah, so they're attracting pollinators of some variety. So oftentimes flowers are, they are co-evolved with a pollinator to draw in that pollinator. It's a beneficial relationship for both the plant and the pollinator. The plant gets its pollen moved from one place to another, and so it can fertilize other individuals. The animal gets a tasty snack, usually, depending on the plant. And so the animal benefits and the plant benefits. Flowering plants that are not pollinated by animals often have flowers that you might not think of as flowers. So for example, the grasses, you've seen the little things that come out the top of the grasses with the little pollen things that dangle down. Grasses are wind pollinated. So they don't have any showy petals, they're not producing any nectar, they're just producing vast, vast quantities of pollen and then relying on the wind to blow it from the male, where the male is producing the pollen, where the female's at. So generally wind pollinated things are not investing in pretty flowers, they're not investing in nectar, they're investing in just making as much pollen as possible. Yeah?
Do grasses still have fruits?
Yeah, the covering, okay, so have you ever harvested wheat?
No, but I've seen.
You know how it comes in a head and each little grain is contained in some little papery bits? The papery bits are the fruit. Yeah, as I said, some fruits you wouldn't necessarily think of as fruits. Yep. And well, that's not a grass, but dandelions, the little parachute that's attached to the seed is a fruit. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that don't necessarily look like fruits.
So fruits are kind of just like seed accessories?
Yeah, fruits are they kind of are. Fruits are, by definition, a fruit is something that it is derived from the ovary of the parent plant. The ovary is the parent tissue that surrounds where the seed is going to develop. And so the parent plant actually makes the fruit, not the offspring. And so it's a tissue that's derived from the ovary and it usually acts as a seed accessory in that it usually helps the seed get from one place to another, whether that is by being picked up by an animal and consumed in the case of a sweet fruit. That's usually the function fruit is you're getting seed dispersal from an animal that's actually coming to eat the fruit. Or in the case of like a dandelion, the wind is going to catch that parachute and move the seed. All right. Okay, so I got one more. I've been stepping down and down and down in terms of the groups here. One more categorization within the angiosperms. So there's actually a fair amount of diversity within the angiosperms, but you'll notice there's actually not a whole lot of these guys. Only 2% of angiosperms are magnolias. Less than 1% are the star anise and relatives. Less than 1% are water lilies. And there's only one species that's that guy. The vast majority of angiosperms are in one of these two categories, the monocots and the eudicots. These used to just be called dicots, and they changed the name on us because some of these guys used to be lumped in with the dicots, and then when they took them out, they changed the name from dicot to eudicot. The roots of these words here, mono, what does that mean? One. And then cot is referring to a cotyledon. So a cotyledon is an embryonic leaf. These are plants that have a single embryonic leaf. And then eu is Greek for new. So when they changed the name, they changed it from dicot to eudicot, as in like the new dicots.
Mm-hmm.
And then di would be two, and then cotyledon is embryonic leaf. So this is the new two embryonic leaf plants. All right, so let's take a look at what that looks like. Monocots versus eudicots. So the monocots, they do only have a single embryonic leaf. So this is the embryo down here. This is actually a corn grain. Most of this up here is what we would call endosperm. It's a structure that is not part of the embryo, but is present in the seed to provide a food source for the developing embryo. So when you think about a corn grain, most of that starchy, like think about popcorn, for example. Most of that starchy stuff up at the top is going to be the endosperm. Down at the very base of the corn grain is where the embryo is going to be located. And within that embryo, there's just a single, this is the root, this is the leaf, and there's just a single leaf that's going to grow. So that's a monocot. This is a eudicot. Good example of eudicot is something like a bean. Again, there's a lot of starch in that bean, but if you look at, whoa, what did I do? Go away. If you look at the embryo, this is the embryo here. Again, here's the root. This one has two embryonic leaves. And so when you plant these things, if you've ever planted seeds, you can tell whether it has one or two embryonic seed leaves. As it germinates and comes up out of the soil, if there's two little leaves, it's a eudicot. If there's just one little leaf, it's a monocot. So if you've ever planted grass in your lawn, you know when those seeds germinate, it just starts with one little leaf. If you've ever planted radishes or anything like that, they come up and have two leaves, right? Couple other ways, I think I can finish this real quick. Couple other ways to tell apart monocots and eudicots. Monocots tend to have petals in their flowers in multiples of 3. Eudicots tend to have petals in their flowers of multiples of 4 or 5. If you look at the pollen grains, monocots have a single pore or furrow. Eudicots have 3 pores or furrows. And probably the most useful way is actually looking at the vascular tissue. So if you look at a leaf, monocot leaves have veins that are run parallel to each other. So think about a grass blade. There's all those parallel veins. Whereas a eudicot have branched web veins. There's also some differences in the stems as well, but that's not. We'll talk about that more later. All right.